Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, the Israeli military says it's killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Hospitals in Gaza say they're running low on food and medicine as the siege of Jabalia continues. The US military carries out several airstrikes on Houthi underground weapons storage facilities in Yemen. And Donald Trump calls the events of January 6 as a day of love during a campaign event with Hispanic voters. Welcome. Israel reports it has killed the leader of Hamas in Gaza. Yahya Sinwar is believed to have been a key figure in orchestrating the October 7th attacks on Israel last year. Reports suggest DNA testing is currently being conducted on a body believed to be that of Sinwar. And this comes as the US military carried out several airstrikes on Iran-backed Houthi underground weapons storage facilities in Yemen. Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin said the US Air Force B-2 bombers conducted precise strikes on 5 underground weapons sites that housed advanced weapons in Houthi-controlled areas. Well, for more, I'm joined by retired Colonel Brendan Kearney, veteran of the First Gulf War and a former Chief of Staff for US Marines Europe. Sir, good of you to make time to speak to us. If we may, let's begin with what the US did over Yemen overnight. Targeting some underground weapons storage facilities. They said a targeted strike, this time from a stealth B-2 bomber that was flown all the way from Missouri to Yemen, and the first time one of those aircraft used in combat since 2017. That's 7 years. What does that signal?
Well, I think Rosanna, it continues to signal the U.S. resolve in engaging the Houthis. They're in Yemen. They continue to cause problems, with the passage of ships out there. And the United States is clearly indicated over its actions during the past months that that's an intolerable situation. So those aircraft flying out of Missouri were probably carrying some of the very, very heavy bunker-busting bombs that can penetrate deep into the earth and obviously destroy anything that they're targeted against.
Yeah, and some analysts, military analysts, pointing out that those big bunker-busting bombs you're talking about, one of them the GBU-57, they can go so deep underground that this may have been also, of course, it's an indirect warning to Iran, given who's sort of behind the Houthis, but that it also could signal what the US is capable of doing over Iran as well, that it could attack hardened Iranian nuclear facilities. Do you buy that?
I do. I think there's a number of things. First of all, it's the practicality of using a weapon like that. The Houthis are not dumb people. They've gone ahead and they've buried into bunkers their weapons caches. And the United States, over a period of time, probably with the help of the Israelis and other of our Western European allies, have identified where these sites are located. So therefore, they become targets, and then they become engaged. So, and if you can go ahead and do something like that, and also send a signal to the main sponsor of all the mischief in that part of the world, which is Iran, then so be it. Let them understand that they could be the recipients of this type of effort.
And I will come back to discussing Iran with you, because I know you've got a lot to say on the topic, but just on the B-2s, the bombers, the last time they did fly was apparently this 30-hour round mission from the US to Libya. That was back when they bombed an IS, an Islamic State training camp in Libya. And I'm just interested to ask you, I understand you weren't Air Force specifically, but from your military expertise, how those types of decisions get made to send such a sophisticated aircraft so far around the world to take out that kind of mission. So many years in between, this was clearly deemed that important.
Yeah, what happens is it's an analysis of what the target is, and in this case, you've got a target in Yemen, and you determine based on what you know about that target, the type of weapons that you need to employ against it. then it becomes a question of what aircraft do you have or missile that you could actually employ against that target. And obviously, distance plays a big role in that. But these bombers are extremely capable. It's a long way to go. They get refueled along the way. It's a very deliberate plan. But they fly from that Air Force base here in the United States because that's their home base. That's where they have all the maintenance facilities that are available to look after these type of aircraft. So it's a very deliberate decision. It's not something that's taken, easily. And they want to, if you're going to go ahead and fly against a target, you want to be successful. And we'll be waiting here probably for a number of days to find out whether they were successful or not.
Indeed, those battle damage assessments, as they're called, from the strikes are still underway, and the US military saying they don't currently indicate that civilian casualties were a part of those strikes. Is that probable?
It's very, very difficult when you use the type of weapon systems that we're talking about to avoid civilian casualties. When you look at some of the examples in other parts of the Middle East now, where there has been deliberate efforts on the part of, say, Hamas and Hezbollah to go ahead and locate their weapons caches in areas that are normally not struck because they're surrounded by civilian casualties. In these particular places in Yemen, we haven't seen where exactly those targets are, but hopefully they were struck and there were no civilian casualties. I think that's what all of us hope for. But unfortunately, war is an extraordinarily ugly thing, combat and conflict. So if there are civilian casualties, sadly, I wouldn't be surprised.
And the Houthis, as would be expected, and very much the message that we hear day in, day out at the moment with everything happening in the Middle East, vowing retaliation for those strikes. What do you think that will look like?
Oh, I think they'll be firing some more missiles and launching drones against some of the merchant shipping and the U.S. naval presence that's just off the coast. They've been pretty consistent in the way they respond. There's really not much else they can do. They've fired missiles, at Israel as part of their response, again in support of Hamas's efforts in Gaza in defending itself. So, they really have limited options. But again, they've been effective. They've caused casualties. They've sunk a couple ships. So we'll have to just wait and see what they do here over the next couple of days. But certainly there will be a further response from the United States, or maybe even from some of the other European friends and allies that are also concerned about the interdiction that the Houthis are causing with global maritime trade.
Well, talking about things either escalating or de-escalating and allies or foes getting involved, there is a very important piece of news we must get to. But as you and I are talking, and that's evident from the sun rising behind you where you are stateside, news is still being confirmed. So when this airs, that may have changed, but news still being confirmed that the Israeli military may have taken out Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who is, of course, believed to be the mastermind behind the October 7th attacks and was a huge target for Netanyahu's government. We're going to have to speak in hypotheticals because we don't have that confirmation yet. But if it is confirmed, how significant will that be?
Well, it poses, immediate significance, but there's, this is the classic case of be careful for what you ask for. We don't know, at least the general public, including myself, is not privy to who this next follower behind Sinwar that would assume the leadership responsibility. He might turn out to be someone who is more capable, might turn out to be someone who is more evil. We don't know. But, taking him out certainly causes a problem for Hamas. And the Israelis have been masterful here, not only in their operation in Gaza, in essentially decapitating the leadership of Hamas, but also against Hezbollah up in Lebanon. So, those organizations right now are probably very, very much in turmoil in attempting to go ahead and determine who is their leader and can their leader effectively communicate, because apparently when they start to communicate, they become targets of the Israeli Defense Forces. And certainly the Israelis have been looking for Sinwar here since October 7th, and they may have found him. I guess we'll have to wait and see here until there's an announcement either from Hamas or from the IDF.
And you make that point there that, of course, Israel have been very successful in their own strategic aims of taking out the command structure of Hezbollah, one after the other, after the other. But plenty of people you speak to say it doesn't sort of matter because there will always be a replacement. There'll always be a deputy to move up the ranks. Is that what you were saying is possible with Hamas? Will this be such a symbolic kill that it could dismantle the organization or not?
I'd be very surprised if the organization was dismantled. The organization has existed for a number of decades. It's a combination of a terrorist organization and a criminal organization. Some of their leadership are extraordinarily wealthy, and a lot of them don't even live in Gaza. They're off in Qatar or other places around the world. So I don't think it's to their benefit organizationally to go ahead and dismantle themselves. I don't think, they've got an awful lot of support throughout Gaza and throughout the Palestinian world and the Arab world. And there's lots of Americans that support them, as has been evidenced on some of the street demonstrations we've watched over the last year here in the United States. So I think, unfortunately, they're going to stay around. They're going to continue to cause mischief, mayhem, and the world is a poor place because they exist. But I don't think we can just simply get rid of them.
So in terms of the way that Israel has conducted itself, not only in Lebanon, you spoke there, regards Hezbollah, but of course in Gaza, another strike today on this Jabalia refugee camp, killing and injuring dozens and dozens of people. Israel saying that this was a, quote, precise strike on a meeting point for Hamas and the Islamic Jihad group inside the compound. But of course, rights groups warning of an absolutely dire situation for Palestinians still in Gaza. Very interesting this week to see this leaked letter that the US wants to put strain on Israel and basically say, let aid in or you will not get military assistance. Did you ever expect to see that?
I'm not surprised this is going on. First of all, I think the Israelis, they identify targets, and Hamas and Hezbollah have been masterful in going ahead and surrounding themselves, with innocent civilians, making their headquarters underneath hospitals, in schools, in schoolyards. They've done this repeatedly. They've used non-governmental organizations as cover for themselves. So the Israelis, their intelligence appears to be getting better and better, are identifying where these meetings are taking place, and they're not going to let the fact that it's inside a refugee camp go ahead and deter them. And what happens, and again, this is a terribly sad situation. What happens is the innocents end up being victims alongside the targets of Israel. And, Joseph Biden has a terrible challenge on his hand because he and Kamala Harris are courting the Muslim vote, which is not insignificant here in the United States. They also want to support Israel. The same guy that here a couple of days ago sent the THAAD missile battery off to help defend Israel against what is perceived to be a series of Iranian attacks that will happen in the near future. So he's trying to balance this, and he's not doing a very good job, to be honest with you. But that's the reality of the American position with Israel and the American position in the Middle East.
Am I taking it that you're sort of saying he's fence-sitting? He's doing what he thinks is just the absolute necessary in terms of supplying the military weaponry to Israel, whilst also saying that, it's a sensitive issue and that type of thing?
Yeah, that's exactly it. He's, sadly, it's that classic case of trying to satisfy everybody. And oftentimes, in geopolitics, if anything, when you supposedly have friends and allies, you're supposed to support your friends and allies. And to go ahead and to publicly threaten the Israelis. And I mean, the Israelis should not be impeding the delivery of humanitarian supplies. But the Israelis also know that a significant portion of those humanitarian supplies are being taken by Hamas. They're not going to the people that they're intended to. And the Israelis are quite frankly, are furious with that. So, Biden is attempting to satisfy everybody, and he loves to project himself as being a tough guy, and he's not. He's a lame duck president of the United States. His vice president is running for president, and she also wants to appear tough. And it's a sad situation over there. And on top of that, he and Netanyahu clearly do not like each other. And that just exacerbates the relationship between the United States and Israel.
And at the same time, the Israeli military this week accused in a New York Times investigation actually of using Palestinians as human shields in some of their operations, and then also being accused by the UN of targeting UNIFIL sites in southern Lebanon as well. So coming under a lot of criticism and pressure at the same time, regardless of the huge scale of civilian casualties in Gaza and increasingly Lebanon as well. So whilst you're talking about the complex battle environment that they're facing, trying to take out what they see as their terrorist enemies and targets, and civilian casualties being alongside that, they're also being held to account for the way that they are conducting themselves. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the United Nations and certainly other nations around the world, many of them who identify as being friends of Israel, are condemning some of their actions. But again, as you mentioned yourself, a lot of this is done precisely because Israel is going after Hamas and going after Hezbollah. Again, this is retribution. This is revenge for the 7th of October. And in the case of Hezbollah, for the continuing rocket attacks that have gone on since the 7th of October, primarily aimed into northern Israel. The Israelis clearly are fed up. They clearly want to put this situation to an end. But I'm not sure, even with a successful military operation, that this will stop the violence that haunts that part of the world.
Now, I promise to return to Iran, because I know you're very hawkish on Iran. And do you think, obviously with the US election happening stateside, that whether we see a Harris or a Trump White House, we will see a stronger stance on Iran heading forward?
That's a great question. I believe that in the case of a Trump win, we will see a repetition of his first administration in a very, very strong effort on the part of the United States government to deal with Iran. If it's a Harris administration, I'm not as confident. The Harris administration will be an extension of the Biden administration, which in turn is an extension of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration, quite frankly, performed abysmally in its relationship, in its, frantic effort to try to come to some type of agreement with the Iranians. And I think the Iranians played Obama masterfully in getting everything they wanted. And the United States, quite frankly, was played as a fool and continues to be played as a fool by the Biden administration. So I just don't see, honestly, Vice President Harris just doesn't have the understanding of the seriousness of the international situation. She lacks the depth of intelligence and experience to be able to handle these type of situations well. And I just don't see that improving if she gets elected. The Iranians, you have to give them credit. They've done very well in the way they deal with the United States.
And the Iranian foreign minister continuing his tour, I believe he was Egypt today, heading towards Turkey. He's also visited Saudi Arabia recently, clearly out there having those conversations. But do you think Donald Trump would therefore be a more masterful negotiator with Iran if you don't back Harris?
Well, I'm I don't really view him as a masterful negotiator. I know that he claims that. However, I think his instinct, his basic instinct in dealing with Iran, is spot on. He doesn't trust them, and he believes that they respect force. He believes that they need to be dealt with toughly. And I think those basic elements of his policy towards Iran are spot on. And I think the world will be a better place if we don't need an additional conflict, but the Iranians need to be held to account. And they have been up to an awful lot of mischief in the Middle East for a number of decades now. And I think Trump will act basically the same way he did during the first administration. And quite frankly, I thought that was probably one of the most successful dealings any United States government has had in the last 30 plus years in dealing with Iran.
Retired Colonel Brendan Kearney, thank you very much for making time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Well, to Gaza now, where at least 19 Palestinians, including children, were killed in an Israeli attack on an UNRWA school that was sheltering displaced people in North Gaza's Jabalia. This comes as staff at hospitals in Gaza say they're running low on food, with the siege of Jabalia now in its 13th day. Well, for more, I'm joined by the Interim Chair for Medical Aid for Palestinians, Richard Makepeace. Sir, thank you for making time. And just give us a sense of the graveness of the situation for Palestinians in Gaza right now, as per the reports you're getting.
Well, I mean, the situation throughout Gaza is an absolute tragedy. I mean, 98% of the population, according to the UN, are suffering from acute food insecurity. And of course, the ones who will be hurt worst by this are the weakest, the children. And some of them will be developing life-changing problems simply because they've not been able to have food and to grow like normal children. Almost 80% of the population is displaced. There are mountains of sewage and effluent everywhere. And the WHO have been talking about 25% of the population suffering from severe intestinal problems because of drinking unsafe water.
And just so our viewers...
So, I mean, quite apart from the fighting, this is an appalling humanitarian situation.
And just so our viewers can be aware, what is it that your organisation does in terms of providing support?
Well, we have historically provided support to hospitals. We've worked with local partners to try to help the weakest in society, those with special needs, nursing mothers and their children. And we've also pre-positioned supplies in case of flare-ups of fighting, which unfortunately are a regular occurrence in both Lebanon and Gaza, and now increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank. And we're continuing, thanks to the amazing work of our all-Palestinian team in Gaza, to work on these issues. And I really cannot tell you how much I admire the fact that despite losing loved ones, despite being displaced themselves, they are still working for the common good. It's really amazing.
And how are the medical supplies going in terms of the stocks? Are you able to get deliveries in?
It's almost impossible at the moment to get deliveries in. And that obviously is extremely damaging. I mean, 50% of the hospitals in Gaza are completely out of action. And the other 50% are limping along with too little in the way of supplies. They don't have the life-saving machines that are needed for intensive care units or for premature babies or anything like that, even for effective diagnosis. They're short of the most basic things like dressings and disinfectants.
And something that strikes me, Richard, speaking to you there in London, and obviously I'm British as well, and there's a number of doctors that have returned from Gaza back to the UK who might have Palestinian heritage, but they are British doctors. They've gone out to Gaza to help. The stories they're bringing back are absolutely horrific, of course, of what they've seen. But is anybody listening?
The stories are horrific. And again, on behalf of MAP, I would like to say a heartfelt thank you to these brave surgeons and doctors who have joined our emergency medical teams and are still joining our emergency medical teams to try and make a real difference on the front line, as it were. But the stories they tell are extremely dispiriting. They can carry out operations and so on, but all too often the aftercare facilities are very questionable, obviously. If there's not enough food, if there's not safe water, there is a real danger that however brilliant the surgery, the recovery will not be as good as it should be.
I was reading a report from one doctor the other day who returned, who said there were just no medical gowns, no PPE, if you like. She had gloves, but that was about it. What type of a difference does that make when you're trying to sort of perform surgery in the field?
Well, obviously, you need an absolutely sterile environment. I mean, we take this absolutely for granted in our hospitals around the world. And that when that cannot be provided, that's not just a problem, it's an acute problem because infections spread. I mean, as it is, even in the best hospitals, infections sometimes spread despite all the precautions that are taken. But if it's impossible to take precautions, then obviously this becomes a terrible problem.
In terms of starvation risk, if not starvation reality, because the head of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees warning yesterday of the risk of famine in Gaza. At the same time, we're hearing the US demanding proof on the ground that Israel is not pursuing a policy of starvation, especially in northern Gaza around the Jabalia refugee camp. They say, quote, would not just be horrific and unacceptable, but also had implications under international and US law. Now, I appreciate you're not here on the political side of things, but just talk to me about the risk of the lack of food and what that means for people's health.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a huge problem for people's health. People need food to survive, and they need clean water to survive. And when these are not available, disease spreads, and of course, people become progressively weaker. And the weakest, the children, become the most weak. So it is an incredibly dangerous situation. And when you have long-term starvation of this kind, you know, it's not just a simple matter of getting food in and people having generous meals to put on some weight. There needs to be a medically organized process to safely bring people back to having a normal diet. So there is a vast amount of work to be done in Gaza, and the only way that this is going to happen is if there is a full ceasefire.
In terms of where we head into winter, if there isn't a ceasefire, now, of course, pretty much everybody in the world wants a ceasefire at this point. If there wasn't a ceasefire and we continue to see this type of conflict heading into winter, Gaza does experience a tough winter, and some 345,000 Palestinians face catastrophic levels of hunger, is the UN-backed assessment of this. How does winter complicate things?
Well, I mean, the weather will definitely complicate things. I mean, it was not good, obviously, in the summer when it's very hot, but it'll be even worse in the winter when it gets quite cold. And, you know, quite cold is very cold if you don't have warm clothing, if you don't have proper shelter. And no, there is a real risk of an absolute catastrophe and mass deaths across the Gaza Strip. And we're particularly worried about the 400,000 who are stuck in North Gaza. The Israelis are telling them to move and trying to get them to move essentially under threat of fire or bombs. But A, there's nowhere safe for them to go. There are no safe routes for them to follow. And, you know, there is a growing perception that the Israelis are simply trying to erase the whole Palestinian presence in North Gaza.
And there has been concern that Israel is trying to pursue what they've referred to as this general's plan, which exactly is that, to sort of lay siege to the north. And they said, well, we've given evacuation orders for Palestinians to move south, but pretty much everyone I spoke to who is operating in Gaza or trying to support Gazans at the moment says they can't, there's nowhere to go. And it's dangerous everywhere you move. And a lot of Palestinians in the north don't want to leave. And interesting on that point, given that you work with medical aid, is this idea that, some Palestinian doctors have asked for humanitarian corridors to various hospitals in northern Gaza because doctors don't want to leave their patients. They want to safely evacuate with them. I mean, how important is that type of thing?
Well, it's extremely important. And I mean, the most basic thing, if you're evacuating patients, is you need ambulances. And ambulances that are not going to be stopped at checkpoints or attacked from the air with drones or shot at by the Israeli army. And that means there needs to be proper coordination. And as I understand it, that's simply not in place. And even where there is coordination, the UN have found that on many occasions, I think something like 60 or 70%, the UN Secretary General was saying, of UN missions in Gaza have been blocked one way or another by the Israelis, and some have been seriously attacked.
I just want to ask you, while we've got you as well, I appreciate that you deal with Palestinians, but you're obviously aware of everything else that's happening, the multi-front war that Israel's currently engaged in. Lebanon, the risk for cholera is very high. The World Health Organization is warning now after a case of the acute and potentially deadly infection was detected. Polio has been a concern in Gaza. I mean, talk to me about those types of infectious diseases and why they pose such a threat for people who are displaced.
Well, I mean, polio is a horrible disease. Happily, in most parts of the world, it's been eradicated, but it attacks particularly children with life-changing effects. I mean, they may never walk again. They may die. It's acutely infectious. And I note that the Israeli army were very quick to inoculate their soldiers. I think they were less helpful in allowing the UN to inoculate children, though I know huge efforts have been made. But I think this highlights the point that, neither Gaza nor Lebanon were in a comfortable state before the war began. I mean, Gaza has been under siege for decades, and there have been regular Israeli bombardments. Supplies coming in have always been strictly regulated. And there have been a number of wars over the years with big bombing attacks on Gaza. There was never enough electricity, for example. So, these were weak societies in terms of infrastructure and everything else before the war started. And the same is also true of Lebanon, particularly after the massive explosion in Beirut, which caused so much damage, and also the economic turbulence, which means that many people barely have enough funds to survive. So, add to that attacks apparently on civilian targets, attacks on UNIFIL, which is there because of a mandate from the United Nations Security Council, can only make things hugely worse.
Just finally, and I want to talk to you about, and as we are speaking, these reports are still being confirmed, so we have to speak about it in the hypothetical, but reports that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, that Netanyahu and the Israeli military have been long seeking for in Gaza, that they may have taken him out in a strike. Now, as you and I are speaking, as this is recording, that hasn't been fully confirmed yet, but I just want to ask your opinion, Richard, as to how this could change things if that is confirmed.
Well, I'm afraid it won't change things. It's well known, I think, at least amongst the diplomatic community and also the military, actually, that you cannot destroy an ideology with large-scale military activity and bombing civilians. That simply doesn't work. The Israelis tried it in Lebanon with the PLO, and that didn't work. And they're now trying it in Gaza with Hamas, and I don't believe that will work either. If you want to defuse a situation of this kind, if you want to have a complete game changer, then you need to start looking at the real issues, which are about Palestinian rights and about occupation. and you need to start a process for a just settlement. I think this is the lesson of all conflicts, including one that was in our country.
Interim Chair for Medical Aid for Palestinians, Richard Makepeace, thank you.
Thank you.
Elsewhere, to the US election now, where during a campaign event, former President and Republican candidate Donald Trump was questioned about the events of January 6th, which he labeled a day of love. He made the comments when asked why people should vote for him when he waited so long to take action, while his supporters were attacking the Capitol during a town hall with an audience of Latino voters, a crucial demographic for the 2024 race.
But that was a day of love from the standpoint of the millions. It's like hundreds of thousands. It could have been the largest group I've ever spoken before. They asked me to speak. I went and I spoke. And I used the term peacefully and patriotically. If you look at the Democrats, what they say, you look at Maxine Waters and you look at Hillary Clinton and you look at what they say, and they don't put that on. They only put Republicans on. But they couldn't get me because of the fact that I said everything's got to be peaceful.
Well, the former president also criticizing the Biden-Harris administration for the ongoing illegal immigration crisis during a town hall event with undecided Hispanic voters. The Republican presidential nominee asserting that Hispanic voters are, quote, most against illegal migration across the border.
A lot of the jobs that you have and that other people have are being taken by these people that are coming in. And the African-American population and the Hispanic population in particular are losing jobs now because millions of people are coming in. So they're coming in, but they're also coming in largely, and tremendous numbers coming in out of mental institutions. They're emptying out mental institutions. They're emptying out insane asylums. That's a step above a mental institution. Worse, bigger problems.
Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris engaged in a heated discussion with Fox News, stating her presidency would differ significantly from President Joe Biden's.
My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas. I represent a new generation of leadership. I, for example, am someone who has not spent the majority of my career in Washington, D.C. I invite ideas, whether it be from the Republicans who are supporting me, who were just on stage with me minutes ago, and the business sector, and others who can contribute to the decisions that I make.
Well, for more, I'm joined by the chair of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson. Greg, thanks so much for making time for us. And given, you're the chair of the Republican Overseas UK, let's start by talking about Donald Trump's performance in his Univision town hall there in Florida. It's fair to say he faced some tough questions from the crowd. How do you think he handled it all?
I think he handled it pretty well. I mean, he's somewhat inconsistent and sometimes unfiltered, to say the least. But I think he handled it well. He's doing very well with Hispanics, specifically in Florida, but he's doing well overall with Hispanics. If you compare, his distance with Hispanics, African Americans, as well as even young people, compared to the advantages that Hillary Clinton had in 2016 and Joe Biden had in 2020, that gap is really narrowed. And in many of the swing states, he actually leads with Hispanics. So this is kind of a new era in terms of the Democrats' dependency on identity groups. If they don't win those identity groups by the same margins they have in the past, it could be real trouble for them. So I thought he handled it pretty well.
You're right. We've seen him speak to roomfuls of black voters, roomfuls of Hispanic voters. This one, a particularly tough question, came from somebody who says they pick basically sort of fruits and vegetables in the US. And they said there are workers, and if Trump was to get rid of migrant farm workers, who else would there be to do that type of work? He's obviously talking about the illegally migrant workers. Now, some are saying Trump didn't directly respond to that question. He just spoke about illegals in general. Don't you think it was a fair question to ask, though?
I do. And sometimes I wish President Trump would just answer the question simply. And we could say that about many politicians. But I think he had an opportunity there to clarify the difference between legal and illegal. And the shame is it's a human rights tragedy as well. The illegal migrants have virtually no bargaining power, no ability to unionize and join the organizations that in many ways can protect them. So I think it's really it makes the companies, the agriculture companies that hire illegal migrants, to blame as well. And I think that we need to remind people that it's not only difficult because it lowers wages and makes things more difficult for American workers, including immigrants, but also point out that it makes it really challenging for these illegals to have any bargaining power.
Now, elsewhere, another very testy question he got was about his response to the events that happened on January 6th. And somebody saying, I couldn't vote for you again based on the way that you handled those events. Trump coming out then and saying, well, it was a day of support for me. He actually referred to it as a day of love. Do you think that's going to help him?
I don't know that it will help him. It's a difficult topic, obviously. That the January 6th was, a disgrace on so many measures, so many metrics. And so I think it's a difficult one for him. He does try to remind people that, many of the people in Washington on that day were indeed, protesting peacefully and patriotically, which is something he indicated on that day. So I don't know how he ever turns that into a winner. But it's also one that he has to handle delicately. I don't think you get some of those voters back, no matter what. I think, we probably lost, a single-digit percentage of even Republican voters that just, found that to be unpalatable. And so he's doing his best, I think, to address it and remind people that there were plenty of good people there in Washington on that day.
In terms of talking about winners and Republicans who can't back what they see as the indefensible, somebody else in the audience I believe it was at the Univision event in Florida, standing up and saying, why should we back you when plenty of Republicans won't back you? They've turned their backs on you. They've almost defected. How to handle that?
Well, I think, he would do better to remind people that plenty of Democrats have come over to the Republican side and actually are supporting him. If you consider RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, as well as Elon Musk and even, hedge fund managers like Bill Ackman, who's a lifelong Democrat and continues to identify as a Democrat. But, so I think it's happening on both sides. It sort of indicates the realignment of the parties that, the Republicans are now the party of the working class and the Democrats are more the party of the elites and, the coastal elites. And I think that's relatively new. I mean, that's only in the last 10 or so years. So it just points to the realignment. Many of the Republicans that have supported Trump publicly also have some personal baggage, right? I mean, obviously, Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney, there's no love lost between those families. And so, there's a bit of personal in some of those endorsements. I don't know that that Liz Cheney can go on talking about the Constitution and saving the Constitution or saving democracy when so many of the things that Kamala Harris wants to do are in direct conflict with constitutional norms, like stacking the Supreme Court or eliminating the filibuster, eliminating the Electoral College. So I think, President Trump could do a better job of articulating that. I think J.D. Vance does a much better job of articulating that message.
Let's think for a moment about women's issues, if we like to put it that way. But Trump calling himself the father of IVF, and others point out, and we will get to Harris and her appearance on Fox News, that she didn't really corner the sort of women's issue side of things in a way that she could. Is Trump trying to get more women over to his camp?
I think so, because right now, according to the polls, the women favor, it's a massive gender difference between Trump and Kamala. And so, Trump has a lot of room to catch up. He has a lot of opportunity because right now, so many women, especially single women, are supporting Kamala Harris. And I think he's got plenty of upside there, to say the least. And I think he has some good arguments to make. He's not as pro-life as many of us conservatives would like. He's definitely tilted to the center on that. The Republican message in general, and it's even in the documents that came out of the convention, are indicating that the party is very much against late-term abortion or third trimester abortion, but not necessarily against abortion in the first trimester. So I think that that's very new for Republicans, and I don't think they've done a great job of articulating that. But the current Democrat policy is, taxpayer funded up until birth. That's not the party of Bill Clinton, safe, legal, and rare. So that's kind of a message that there's a bit of room to basically re-argue that point, but also on other women's issues, starting with inflation. Many women, especially mothers, are having problems putting food on the table, putting petrol in their cars. That's the number one issue for Americans right now is inflation in the economy. Trump leads by 10 points on the economy and 12 points on inflation over Kamala. And then, of course, you have the border crisis, which really affects women. The amount of forced prostitution, sex trafficking, we've based the Biden and Harris administration in many ways have turned over border security to the human and drug trafficking cartels. That's a big women's issue. I think he needs to do a better job of articulating that. And then, of course, you have the cultural things like women's sports being compromised by trans men. That's something that really hits home, especially with the suburban mothers. And I would rank that as an issue that benefits Trump in this election. So, there's a lot of things that are specifically women's issues that he could do a better job of articulating.
And certainly his running mate, his deputy, J.D. Vance, singling out childless single cat ladies, that didn't go down so well earlier on in the race. And you mentioned there that Harris very much has the single female voter on the side, on the Democrat side, but her appearance on Fox News was in large part to try and win over the Republican, the conservative female voter, the ones you're talking about there, especially the suburban mum types who are concerned about immigration, who might typically vote Republican. So do you think she was at all successful in that?
I don't think so. And I'm not just from watching it. It was a really hard segment to watch, real difficult. I almost felt sorry for her at the end, but wasn't quite the disaster that the Biden June 27th debate was with Trump that really, in effect, ended Biden's nomination. But it wasn't great. I don't think she was able to sway any undecideds or especially Republican women over to support her because she didn't really answer any of the questions. And so, I was surprised she did it. I think it shows that there's a bit of desperation or at least concern in the Harris campaign. And it really, the timing was odd too. She did not have a good appearance with The View, which is obviously very, very left leaning, nor did she with 60 Minutes, which is also, fairly left leaning. So she's had a difficult time in the press as she's doing more press interviews. And this wasn't a good moment for her. I don't think it was a winning moment for her at all.
Why did you find it a difficult watch? Because those on her side said that she had a very difficult time with Brett Baier, the host, the Fox News host, that he was constantly talking over her and interrupting, but you didn't get that sense.
Well, I think he was forced to because she just wouldn't answer the question. Every question about big issues, top issues for American voters, she replied with Trump, and everything was about Trump, and without really addressing, the border policies. I thought that was the most obvious one, and I think this is a moment where she could have really addressed those issues. She's really conflicted because on one hand, on the interview with The View, she basically said she wouldn't do anything differently and that she was in the room for every major decision. And then last night on Fox, she was trying to say, we're turning the page. I'm not Joe Biden. Let's turn the page and move forward. I'm not sure that she's handled that perfectly because it's going to be really difficult for her to separate herself from the decisions that have been so unfortunate and the outcomes have been so difficult made life very difficult for American voters. So I thought it was an opportunity for her. I thought it was very good of her to agree to do the interview, even though I was surprised. But I think it's the point where, there's that moment where you just can't deny the obvious anymore. We, of course, saw that on June 27th with Biden, but I think we saw a little bit of that last night, that we can't deny that she, does not instill confidence in having vision or even aptitude for it. So, and again, I'll just go back to J.D. Vance for a minute. He's actually shown to be much more articulate at delivering the message. You saw that in the debate. And I think some of his past mistakes, like the cat lady comment, granted, that was years ago, 2021, I believe. But I think in the debate with Tim Walz, he really gave permission for suburban women to vote for Trump. I think that was a real turning point in the debate. And I think if both candidates can articulate that women can indeed, if they look past, the one issue that Democrats are trying to make a top issue, which is abortion. But this is a party of it's gone from pro-choice to pro-abortion. And I think there's a difference there. So if that could be articulated better, and JD started with that in his debate with Walz, I think they should continue that. And there's a lot of room to get both single and married women to vote for Trump.
The polls, the national average of the polls, do tend to continue to be very, very tight indeed, with Harris maintaining just a very slight lead over Trump. Now, in terms of there only being a few days left, really, until the election, so just over 2 weeks to go, I mean, what could happen? Is it all still to play for?
Yeah, I think there could always be an October surprise. I mean, we've had about 5 of them already in this campaign. Such massive events like the assassination attempts and again, the June 27th debate, dropping Biden and installing Kamala Harris as the candidate. These are all relatively unprecedented moments. So yes, there could be another one, but the trend is pretty good for Trump. Even a week ago, it felt like a real dead heat, but in the last few days, the most recent polls are showing Trump really strong in the swing states, and even a couple have come out with him leading nationally. So, the real clear average is still basically a dead heat. All the swing states are well within the margin of error, probably within a point. But I think that the trend is definitely toward President Trump. Vice President Harris has just had a difficult 2 weeks with some missteps and with some of the media appearances. And I think last night was just another one.
Look, you're speaking to us, I believe, from Dublin today, but you are based normally in the UK. What are Republicans overseas saying? Are they feeling confident?
Yeah, there's a great confidence. I think if the election was tomorrow, given the recent polls and the trend, I think President Trump would win. The challenge is the Democrats are really good at getting out the vote. They've been doing this for generations, but they did it especially well in 2020 with the mail-in voting and in 2022 in the midterms. And they're just really good at ballot harvesting and doing the door-to-door work. The Republicans are doing that, that's for sure. We're just playing a little catch-up there. So I think the great risk for the Republicans right now, both in the presidential race and even down the ballot, is to get out the vote machine of the Democrats. We are doing it. We are sending volunteers into the swing states and poll watchers as well. So, but that's I think the one great advantage they have. Kamala Harris has raised $1 billion since she was made the nominee. So she's far out spending and far out raising the Republicans. So they have that money advantage, which translates quite often into that ground game. But again, Republicans, we are trying, we are doing it. The Republicans in the UK are really enthused about this election. And I think we'll see a much higher turnout than we have historically.
What does that $75 million cash injection from Elon Musk into Trump's sort of campaign and the wider Republican campaign mean in terms of actual impact?
Yeah, I think it will. Every little bit helps. And I think what you'll see is 2 things. I don't think it'll translate into a massive advertising spend. And there's a reason for that. The Harris campaign spent $240 million in the swing states in the last few months versus $104 million for the Trump campaign, and yet the needle did not move. If anything, Harris went down in the polls. So I don't think advertising is going to do it. They did post the Bret Baier interview, the Fox interview. The Trump campaign posted that last night, and they called it our latest campaign ad. I thought that was pretty funny, but also it's free. It doesn't cost anything. So that probably works better than advertising. Where they will put the money is in the ground game. It's hiring volunteers or transporting volunteers to the swing states, putting them up housing, giving them phones, giving them data. I think there's a lot of that. Again, in many respects, we're playing catch up to the Democrats on that. They have so much more financial resources, but I do think it's money well spent because it really comes down to the ground game in those swing states.
I mean, money aside, which is always handy, do you think it's a good thing, Greg, that Elon Musk supports Donald Trump? Do you think that's helpful?
I think it is, yeah, because I mean, for two reasons. One is he brings he's in a different lane than traditional Republican voters. You know, he's younger, he's an immigrant, he's very successful, he's in, you know, sort of future looking businesses. And it's interesting to see, I think it points out something that should be obvious, but the people that are, the Republicans that have come over to support Kamala Harris are really from, you know, the old Republican guard. They're from the past. You know, this is the Cheney family from the 2000s, and it kind of reminds people of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's very yesterday. Barack Obama, who was elected, you know, almost 20 years ago, two decades ago, 16 years ago. You've got Bill Clinton that was campaigning, major misstep on his part because he pointed out the sad death of Laken Riley in Georgia, and that will definitely help President Trump in Georgia. And so there's been some missteps, but they're all from politicians of the old days. And Elon Musk is a very future-looking person, you know, between Tesla and, of course, SpaceX. You know, he is a new generation. He's got an affiliation with crypto. So he's kind of a new, fresh face and very forward-looking. You could say the same with Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. Granted, he's older, he's in his 70s, or low 70s, but and from a legendary family. But it's more the things that he argues about: freedom of speech, censorship, vaccines, and some troubling things about nutrition and food ingredients. So these are all sort of new issues, new for Republicans, but also new for a lot of Americans. So it's an interesting contrast between, you know, the Elon Musk endorsement and support versus Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and the Cheneys. It's a really interesting difference.
It is an interesting difference to have it laid out like that in that contrast. Look, it's good speaking to you always. Chair of Republicans,
Thanks, Rosanna.
Overseas UK, Greg Swenson.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the former White House Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton, David Kusnet. David, thank you very much for making time. And very simply, Kamala Harris's outing on Fox News, how do you think it went?
I think it went well. It showed that she is willing to go on media platforms that don't often host people with her point of view and speak to audiences who unfortunately don't get to hear her point of view. And it shows that she's running to be president of all Americans, not just of the Americans most likely to vote for her.
I mean, yeah, let's talk about how necessary it is for the candidates to do this, to go into unfriendly territory, if you like, because for Kamala Harris, it doesn't get much more unfriendly than Fox News, probably vice versa for Trump if he were to do MSNBC or similar. He's been courting, in fact, groups of voters that may not be amenable to him. I mean, it comes with risks, but it also comes with benefits, doesn't it? I mean, what part of the risk calculus is it?
That's right. I mean, I think the benefit is not only that the immediate audience gets to hear her make the case for herself, but also that a wider audience is aware that she did this and gives her points for courage and openness and for speaking to and for all Americans, not just part of the country.
Well, yes, she was asked whether she viewed Republican voters, Trump voters, as stupid, and she said, "I'd never speak that way about the American people." Was that a smart way to respond?
That's right. And that's in contrast with her opponent, who uses that word very often to describe people he disagrees with or is an adversary of.
Look, one of the big stated aims of this Fox News interviews was to try to win over conservative women, Republican women that wouldn't want to vote Kamala Harris. They didn't previously want to vote Hillary Clinton either, but they might not want to vote Donald Trump. So do you think she was successful in that?
Well, I think it's a good medium to reach Republican women who I think have growing doubts about Donald Trump. It may not be a mind changer, but it's a mind opener. And there are almost 3 weeks left for her to make the case to this audience and to other audiences.
In terms of getting her points across, though, because some people point out that Harris's weakness, or a lot of people point out that her weaknesses are that we don't really know what her policy points are on a number of things. Do you think that's getting clearer or stronger now?
I think it's getting clearer. People can go, I mean, for instance, people can go on her website and find a link to an 80-page economic program, which is pretty substantive. This is someone who does have a public record as district attorney in the Bay Area of California, as state attorney general in California, as a United States senator, and as vice president of the United States. So I don't think it's entirely accurate to say that she has no public record. And people have had the opportunity to follow her in real time, and now they can go on her website and listen to her and research her and learn a lot about her. I think she has a much longer public record than in public office than the former president does. And she certainly has a longer public record than the Republican nominee for vice president, who has been a senator for 2 years.
Let's talk about the fact that Kamala Harris is trying to appeal to a Republican audience. That's normal at this point in an electoral race, that each side has to start appealing to what's known as the swing voters to try and win them over. But does it risk turning some of the the Democrat voters off Harris, that they see her basically courting Republicans?
Well, I think the Democratic voters understand that she is running to be president of all of this country, which includes Republican voters. And I think most Democrats have Republican friends and family members and neighbors and coworkers. And I think the Democratic voters also understand that there are a lot of traditional Republican voters in this country, especially women, who do not see their own values reflected in Donald Trump, which I think explains why at a time when President Biden and former Presidents Obama and Clinton are campaigning for Kamala Harris, there are no former Republican presidents or vice presidents, and even very few members of Donald Trump's own cabinet, and even his own former vice president, who are campaigning for him. So I think that Kamala Harris's supporters understand that there are a lot of people who, in ordinary times with an ordinary nominee running against her, would not support Vice President Harris, but who in these times are opening their minds to supporting her. And I think they understand that the vice president is going to be saying and doing things that will first try to open minds and then try to change minds.
And that's something that audience members in Trump's Univision town hall seized upon and said, well, if Republicans are turning their back on you, then why should we back you? But also keen to point out that there have been defectors, of course, from the Democrats over to the Trump camp. We've seen Tulsi Gabbard, for one, RFK Jr. Some could even argue Elon Musk fits that category as well. Is that powerful for Trump?
I don't know that Elon Musk is or ever has been a Democrat. And as someone who was when I was much younger, really looked to Robert Kennedy Sr. as an example of what a public figure could be. I think it's understandable that RFK Jr. has had a very difficult time in his life, but it's sad that he's ended up in a place where I think every other member of his own family has repudiated him. And Tulsi Gabbard also is not in the mainstream of the Democratic Party and hasn't been for some time.
In terms of Harris trying to differentiate herself or come out sort of as her own woman, if you like, not in the Biden administration anymore, she's had to walk this difficult balance between deference to her former president, but also respect, but also saying, I'm going to be different, do things differently. Now, at a dinner party the other night, quotes out of President Biden saying she will cut her own path. Is that basically a tacit green light for her to go off and express herself freely?
I guess the short answer is yes. And I think we should keep in mind that that as president starting next year, she'll be serving in very different circumstances from what President Biden served. And President Biden took office after the insurrection on January 6th. It was still in the midst of the COVID pandemic, when there was remote work even in the White House. And he was dealing with a country that was in an economic crisis, a medical crisis, a political crisis, and a social crisis. And while there are, a lot of people are having a hard time now, it's nothing like the condition the United States was in on January 20th of 2021. So she'll be taking office in very different times. She's from a different generation. She's a very different person. And of course she's going to be different.
I just want to ask you, while we've got you finally, given that you were a speech writer, so your thoughts are always about strategy and positioning and language. I'm sure you've talked plenty in the past about Trump and his use of language, but I want to talk to you about one phrase he's using continuously at the moment, which is the enemy within. It's not new, but he's actually been talking about it, saying the enemy from within is more dangerous than China and Russia at the moment. And to that, he sometimes indicates parts of the Democrat Party, people like Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff, calling them Marxists, communists and fascists. When you hear him use that type of language and framing it in that way, does it remind you of anything, or do you think it's clever strategy?
Doesn't remind me of anything that's been used by presidents or major party presidential nominees in the United States. I think you can go through the great presidents of both parties. You can go through two Roosevelts, Ronald Reagan, Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and you never find that kind of language. You don't even find that kind of language with Abraham Lincoln describing people in the states that remained in the Union. He's famous for saying, with malice towards none and charity for all. He isn't famous for talking the way that Donald Trump has been talking. What is concerning is that while Donald Trump's rhetoric is not familiar in the United States of America, it is familiar in other countries that have been governed by autocrats of the left or right. I mean, you can find that language in a lot of countries that are where democracy has been under attack or where dictatorships have triumphed. You can't find that language in mainstream politics in either party in the United States of America.
Very interesting speaking to you, former Director of Speechwriting to President Bill Clinton, David Kusnet. That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.